Imagine the sound of horns slicing through the silence of the early morning. The sky is still dark, the fog thick, and the first flickers of fire light up the wooden houses. From atop a hill, an old Viking watchman shouts,
"Enemies!"
The village wakes in panic. Children are pulled close by their mothers. Men rush toward the weapons hanging on the walls, and the old village leader, with a scar running down his neck, laces up his boots for the last time. This wasn't a rare scene. For centuries, Viking settlements lived under the constant threat of invasion, not from dragons or mythical beasts, but from other men, just as brutal as they were. Men who came by sea, with fury in their eyes and axes in their hands. And at that very moment, one inevitable question echoed. How did a people known for spreading terror defend themselves when terror came to their doorstep? You know the Vikings as conquerors, as fearless seafarers, as warriors who raided monasteries, burned villages, and returned home drenched in glory. But today, we flip the perspective. Today, you'll see what happened when they were on the other side of the blade. We'll step behind the scenes of Viking defense. Fortresses built by calloused hands. Strategies blending sheer brutality with cunning tactics. Entire communities trained to resist down to their final breath. And most impressive of all, we'll discover that for the Vikings, defending their land wasn't just about survival. It was a sacred act. But before raising shields and building walls, we need to understand the setting of this silent war. Because to truly understand how the Vikings defended themselves, we must first understand what and who threatened their homes. By the end of the 8th century, the icy waters of the North Sea didn't divide people, they connected them. Kingdoms rose and fell like leaves in the wind. Europe was a tapestry of feudal lords, crumbling empires and expanding trade routes. It was a time when alliances shifted with the tide, and survival depended as much on the blade as on diplomacy. It was in this chaotic landscape that the Vikings emerged. Originating from Scandinavia, mainly what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, these people weren't a unified empire. They were independent clans, scattered settlements, bound together by blood, trade, and culture, but also marked by internal disputes, rivalries, and a harsh geography that demanded strength and ingenuity from birth. In popular imagination, Vikings are almost always portrayed as invaders. But the truth is, during much of the Viking Age, they were also invaded. Threats came from every direction. Baltic pirates, Slavic tribes, Saxons, Franks, and even other Vikings who saw in a neighboring village the perfect chance to gain riches or settle an old blood feud. These communities lived under constant tension. Defense wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of life and death. Imagine sleeping every night with an axe by your bed, because the attack could come while you dreamed. On top of that, the growing fame of the Vikings drew in new enemies. Christian rulers, threatened by Viking naval raids, began to organize counterattacks. The Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne, invested heavily in coastal fortifications. And when the Normans, descendants of Vikings, settled in France, it didn't take long for other nations to feel provoked to reclaim what they had once lost. So Viking villages didn't face just one kind of invasion. They had to be ready for fast land assaults, large-scale sea invasions, and even stealthy infiltrations during festivals and religious ceremonies. And that reality shaped their culture. Every village, no matter how small, was both a home and an outpost, a community and a fortress. Now that we understand what threatened Viking homes, it's time to reveal how they turned simple settlements into living fortresses, resilient, deadly, and nearly impenetrable. In medieval Scandinavia, danger was everywhere. And it was in this constant atmosphere of threat that Viking settlements learned to turn their surroundings into a true shield of protection. Defense began long before the battle. It was built into the land, the wood, and the mind. Every village was planned with a simple yet effective logic. Make access difficult, slow the enemy's advance, and protect the heart of the community at all costs. The first line of defense was almost always natural. narrow fjords, steep hillsides, frozen rivers, or dense forests. The Vikings knew how to choose their territories. They didn't just look for fertile land, they looked for defendable positions. They understood that the terrain could be as powerful an ally as the most skilled warrior. But they didn't rely on nature alone. Sharpened wooden fences, known as palisades, formed a defensive ring around the settlements. They were built with heavy logs, driven side by side into the ground, with their tips pointing outward like the teeth of a predator. These barriers blocked quick charges, horseback assaults, and even the advance of shield formations. Just behind the fences, many villages dug deep trenches filled with water, thick mud, or even traps. Hidden stakes, loose stones, concealed pits. It wasn't uncommon for an enemy to sink to their knees just trying to get close. And at the center of it all were the houses. Built from wood, turf, and stone, they were resistant to both cold and violence. But more than just shelter, they served a strategic function. The homes of the strongest warriors were placed in key spots, allowing for fast response. Weapon storerooms were hidden in hard-to-reach places. And in times of high alert, rooftops became watchtowers and platforms for attack. Some of the wealthier and more organized villages had something even more impressive: fortified longhouses. These great halls acted as command centers, communal shelters, and the final line of defense. There, in case of invasion, women, children, and the elderly took refuge while the men fought outside. But security wasn't made of wood alone. The Vikings used psychological strategy. Shields painted with war symbols, banners with fearsome imagery, skulls hung at entrances. All of it was meant to intimidate the enemy before the battle even began. Animals also played a role. Trained dogs, ravens used as natural sentinels, geese that screamed at the slightest movement. Nature itself, shaped by Viking ingenuity, became part of the invisible wall. Another central element was the lookout system. Improvised watchtowers were built on high ground. Guards rotated day and night. In case of danger, smoke signals or the blast of horns echoed from village to village. This created a warning network that often stopped an attack before it even started. The Vikings knew that winning a war began long before the first arrow flew. And it was thanks to this combination of cunning, architecture, and brutality that many of these small settlements survived wave after wave of violence. But of course, no fortress stands on wood and walls alone. The true heart of resistance was in the warriors themselves. Because when the wall fell, it was the Viking body and spirit that held the final line. The enemy breaches the palisade. The smell of burning wood mixes with sweat and blood. Now, there's nowhere left to hide. And what separates life from death is no longer the height of the walls, but the ferocity of those who defend them. At this moment, the Vikings revealed their true strength. Unlike many armies of the time, Viking defense did not rely on a single commander or rigid hierarchy. Each man, and often women too, knew exactly what to do, because they had all trained for this moment since youth. The defense was decentralized, agile, and brutally efficient. When the gates were breached, the Vikings quickly formed battle circles known as reverse shield walls. Imagine a group of warriors shoulder to shoulder, shields locked together, spears pointing outward like a hedgehog ready to wound. This formation allowed them to repel advances, hold off attacks, and by time to reposition internal defenses. If the enemy pushed through the village paths, they were funneled into clever traps. Narrow passages forced attackers to line up, losing their numerical advantage. Houses were deliberately built at strategic angles to allow for flanking attacks, or ambushes by archers hidden on rooftops. Beyond that, the Vikings mastered guerrilla warfare within their own territory. They knew every stone, every curve, every log of the village. They moved like shadows between homes and barrels. They fought with the upper hand, even when outnumbered. Another feared tactic was the use of internal traps. Doors leading to dead ends, floors that collapsed under too much weight, even makeshift traps with boiling oil, hot embers, or freezing water poured onto invaders, all designed to throw them off balance, especially in winter. But it wasn't all brute force. There was intelligence. When they sensed they couldn't win head-on, the Vikings used scatter and regroup tactics. They faked retreat, lured enemies into open areas, then surrounded them with hidden archers. Other times, they set parts of the village on fire to create smoke screens and confuse the invaders. Women were far from mere spectators. Some took up arms. Others tended to the wounded in makeshift field stations. And all of them knew, if defeat came, there would be no mercy. That's why many defended their homes with a fury that froze even seasoned warriors. There was also an invisible but powerful weapon: morale. The Vikings fought not only for survival, but for honor. Losing a village wasn't just losing land, it was losing the soul of the clan. And this awareness drove them to fight to their last breath. Even when all seemed lost, there was always one final plan: escape tunnels, secret shelters in nearby forests, or in extreme cases, the total destruction of the village by their own hands, so the enemy would leave with nothing. These strategies made attacking Viking settlements a high-risk gamble, and many invaders, even with the upper hand, left defeated physically or morally. Because for the Vikings, the fight began where others' fear ended. But not everything was chaos. Behind all that fury, there was preparation. And every Viking warrior knew, no one wins alone. It was the strength of the community that ensured resistance. And that brings us to the beating heart of every Viking village: the united people. In Viking culture, the village wasn't just a cluster of houses. It was a living organism. And every man, woman, and child was a pulsing cell within that collective body. Unlike many other civilizations, the Vikings did not delegate the protection of their community to a military elite. Defense was a shared duty, passed down from generation to generation as a sacred inheritance. From a young age, children learned to handle weapons, but also to read the weather, recognize unusual sounds in the forest, and interpret subtle signs in animal behavior. It was a complete education, blending technique, intuition, and above all, responsibility. And it wasn't just the warriors who defended the village. Every role had its place in the machinery of defense. Blacksmiths, for example, were true masters of war. They forged swords, axes, and spears, but also improved defensive tools, reinforced nails for palisades, lighter and stronger armor, arrowheads crafted with deadly precision. Women were the guardians of the rear. Beyond caring for children and the wounded, they knew how to wield knives, bows, and spears. They trained, they taught, and when needed, they led. Some even became legendary warriors among the clans. The elders, in turn, were the silent strategists. They carried in their memories stories of past battles, forgotten escape routes, and traps that had worked decades before. Their experience guided the most critical decisions in times of crisis. Even the youngest had clear roles. Boys carried messages across the village, while girls helped manage supplies and support the vulnerable. In extreme situations, everyone was ready to fight. But the true bond between them all was the sense of clan. No matter the size of the village or the distance between homes, everyone knew that when danger arrived, they would stand side by side, without hesitation. Ceremonies strengthened this bond. Before battles, the people gathered around the fire to share food, tell stories, and sing songs of courage. These rituals weren't just symbolic. They were invisible fortresses that shielded the collective spirit. There were also village councils formed by respected leaders, veteran warriors, and spiritual figures. They decided where to reinforce the palisades, how to distribute resources, who should stand guard, and who would care for the provisions. Leadership was shared, and that made decisions faster and more effective. The strength of the Viking community came from decentralization. Each individual was at once a warrior, a citizen, and a guardian. This created a web of trust so strong that even in the face of powerful invaders, villages could resist with a force many considered supernatural. And it was precisely this unity that made attacks on the Vikings so difficult. Because even when enemies tore down the walls, what they found inside was not panic. It was an invisible, unbreakable force. fed by generations willing to die, but never to kneel. The Viking soul lived in the collective, and those who tried to destroy a settlement had to face more than weapons. They had to confront the fury of an entire people with one single heart. But even that strength had its limits, and there were moments when resistance was no longer possible. When all seemed lost, the Vikings played their final card, an extreme choice, and a desperately powerful one. There comes a moment when the flames have already consumed the houses. The walls have collapsed, and the bodies begin to pile up. Not even the bravest can hold back the tide. That's when the Vikings do what few expect. They retreat. But this retreat is no sign of cowardice. It is strategy. Viking villages always maintained secret escape routes. Paths hidden among trees, tunnels dug beneath the ground, or simple trails invisible to untrained eyes. These routes led to temporary camps in the mountains, to hidden caves, or to small islands nestled within the fjords. Places prepared in advance, stocked with food, water, and weapons. The people dispersed. The elderly were carried. The children, wrapped in furs, were kept silent. And the warriors, even wounded, were the last to leave, covering the retreat like a human shield wall. To the invaders, the village seemed conquered. But what they didn't know was that they had just lit the fuse of vengeance. While in refuge, the Vikings gathered strength. Neighboring communities were warned by swift messengers. The clan summoned its allies. And above all, they fueled something dangerous: collective rage. Because in Viking culture, retaliation was more than justice. It was honor. Just days later, when the invaders felt secure, the unexpected would strike. At night, through the silent valleys, an ancient sound echoed, the call of war horns, and with them, the return of those who had been thought defeated. Viking vengeance was not blind. It was meticulously planned. They attacked with surprise, knowing every weak spot, every escape route, every careless move made by the enemy. The assault was swift, brutal, and merciless. Often, the aggressor's own villages became the next targets. The Vikings didn't just reclaim what was theirs, they took more. Weapons, food, ships, and they left behind a clear message. To touch a Viking village was to spark a war with a people who never forget. They also used intelligence. Spies tracked enemy movements, and traitors were punished with exemplary cruelty. The sea itself became a path to vengeance. If enemies came by land, the Vikings would surround them from the water. And even if they couldn't strike back immediately, they kept the memory of the invasion alive. In sagas and stories, bards spoke of traitors, of unjust kings, of those who had burned their homes. These stories crossed generations, until one day, someone rose to repay the blood debt. So the retreat was never the end. It was merely the interval between two wars. And more often than not, the second chapter was even more violent than the first. Enemies learned too late that they weren't simply conquering a village. They were facing a people whose resistance was etched into the very fabric of their souls. Because for the Vikings, losing a battle was acceptable, but submitting to another people, never. And so, between calculated escapes and devastating revenge, the Vikings built their reputation. A people who might fall, but always rose again with more fury. But even with all this defense, unity, and strategy, there was something even more powerful holding everything together. Something unseen. Spirituality. A deep faith in the gods, and in the inevitability of fate. To truly understand why the Vikings were so relentless, and why they never feared death, you have to look beyond the swords, the walls, and the battle tactics. You have to look to the sky. In a Viking's mind, every battle was more than a fight for land. It was a test from the gods, a destined chapter on their journey to Valhalla. Norse faith wasn't a religion of comfort. It was a spirituality forged in ice, storms, and blood. And their gods didn't live in temples. They fought alongside men. Odin, the All-Father, was the Lord of wisdom, but also the god of war and honorable death. Thor, with his hammer, protected humans and crushed enemies with thunder. Freya, goddess of fertility, also chose warriors for her own version of paradise. Each god was directly tied to the survival of the clan. Before any raid, the seers, known as Volvas, were consulted. These women, respected and feared, interpreted signs, studied runes, and gave guidance that shaped crucial decisions: when to attack, when to retreat, when to fight to the last breath. If the omens pointed to sacrifice, the clan didn't hesitate. Better to die with honor than live with shame. On village walls, runic symbols were carved into wood to ward off evil and call for protection. Totems representing sacred animals, like Odin's ravens or Fenrir's wolves, were placed strategically, acting as silent guardians. But the real invisible shield came from within. It was the feeling that the soul never perished in vain. That death on the battlefield was a crowning moment, and that, by falling with honor, the warrior was welcomed into the great hall of the brave, where feasts and eternal glory awaited. This belief created a courage that couldn't be broken. Men and women fought without fear, knowing they were fulfilling their role in the cycle of fate. There was no despair, only fury, determination, and pride. In many cases, the warriors themselves performed small rituals before battle, marking their skin with blood, kissing their amulets, chanting prayers to the gods. Each gesture was a way to align their soul with divine will. And when the battle began, they didn't feel alone. They believed the gods were there, in the blowing winds, in the cries of the ravens, in the gleam of blades under the sun. It was this deep spirituality that sustained them through even the darkest moments. When defeat was certain, they didn't surrender. They yielded, but to fate, not to the enemy. And so, Viking spirituality wasn't just a belief. It was a weapon, silent, invisible, but present in every strike, every tactic, every defiant glance toward death. And maybe it's exactly this invisible force that explains why, even with simple villages and crude weapons, the Vikings were able to resist, conquer, and leave a legacy that still echoes today. But to fully close this journey, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to look at the legacies left by these strategies, and how, centuries later, they still inspire modern communities. Today, the wooden walls have rotted away. The shields lie buried beneath the cold earth, and the warriors who once shouted for freedom now rest in silence. But the Viking spirit of resistance that remains alive. Over the centuries, archaeologists have uncovered more than just spears and axes. They've revealed a mindset, a way of life, and of resistance that transcends time. Every stake driven into the ground, every tunnel dug in the frozen earth, every secret escape route carefully planned, all with the work of a people who knew that surviving wasn't enough. They needed to survive with honor. And that honor wasn't just for the warriors. It was in the eyes of mothers hiding their children while the village burned. In the silent steps of the Volvas reading fate with hands covered in runes. In the collective heart of a people who'd rather die fighting than live on their knees. Today, scholars wonder how a people with so few resources managed to stand against greater empires, larger armies, and more organized forces. And the answer is never just brute strength. It lies in unity, in strategy, in faith, and above all, in mindset. The mindset that each clan was more than just a group of people. It was a family, an extension of the very blood that ran through their veins. Many elements of Viking strategy influenced cultures that came after. The concept of self-sufficient villages, the idea of community defense with everyone involved, men, women, elders alike. The importance of secret routes, coded signals, and inter-regional alliances. Even psychological warfare, like using fierce appearances, battle rituals, and myths that struck fear into the hearts of invaders. Today, their stories inspire books, movies, and series. But behind the entertainment lies a raw truth. The Vikings were not just raiders or barbarians. They were survivors, architects of their own protection. And they did it with what they had: stone, wood, fire, and faith. When we look at how they defended their villages, we understand they weren't just protecting land. They were protecting a legacy, a way of life, a spirit, and that spirit endures. In Nordic communities, still singing the old sagas. In descendants carrying pride in their names, their crests, their eyes. And in every person who, even today, refuses to bow in the face of hardship. Because the true legacy of the Vikings isn't found in weapons or ships alone. It's in the courage to resist, the wisdom to adapt, and the unshakable faith that no enemy, no matter how great, can destroy a people who know their roots. The wooden walls may have fallen, but the invisible wall of Viking culture, that one still stands strong.